We Chose Play, Raising an Autistic Child to Thrive and Feel Understood. My new book is now available for purchase at your preferred online bookseller. Learn more at affectautism.com/wechoseplay, all one word. Affect Autism, 10 years of providing free supportive content for your DIR journey.
All of Affect Autism's podcasts are produced and edited by Daria Brown. Please note that the views expressed during all episodes are solely those of the individuals involved, do not constitute educational or medical advice, and do not necessarily reflect the views of Affect Autism, Daria Brown, nor ICDL and associated parties. Listeners should consult with professionals familiar with their individual circumstances for specific support.
You're listening to Autistic Moms Chatting, a We Chose Play podcast from affectautism.com. Welcome back, listeners. I am really excited about this episode because I have two fellow Canadian autistic moms, and we have three of us all have autistic sons. So this episode, I have Kelly Bron Johnson in Montreal, who is an autistic and hard of hearing self-advocate, founder of Completely Inclusive, a social enterprise consultancy devoted to inclusion and accessibility in the workplace. Kelly has also written a book called How to Parent Like an Autistic, which is the most succinct, perfect book that I have read, Kelly. It was like super just to the point and simple, and I highly recommend it. And I also have Borden King, who is the co-founder of Autistics for Autistics, Canada's autistic self-advocacy organization. The group was founded in 2017, and it's an international affiliate of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Organization. She's the host of Noncompliant, a Neurodiversity Podcast, and the author of 3 books, including the forthcoming book, Informed Decisions, a guide for parents of autistic children, to be published by Jessica Kinsley Press in early 2026. She's also written numerous articles and publications, such as for the New York Times and others. And I love your, on the A for A website, the Autism Pseudoscience Physician's Guide. So if there are any medical professionals listening, I will point people to that in the blog post with links. So as I mentioned, we are all autistic. We all have autistic sons. Kelly is the mother of 2 children, age 9 and 15, and Anne is the mother of a 15-year-old, and I'm the mother of a 16-year-old. So welcome to both of you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I thought that we could begin. I want to get into the professional work that you guys do because it's so important, and that's what I want to highlight here for our listeners. Maybe just starting off, just a little bit about your journey with autism. Did it begin with your child's diagnosis?
Yeah, in my case, it did. I'm very lucky, I think, to have grown up in a very progressive, inclusive environment. My elementary school was doing what was called at the time reverse inclusion. They're one of the only schools that was trying this out. So we had what was called satellite schools. So we had the Montreal Oral School for the Deaf students, a miniature version of their school within our school. And we had the Mackay Center here in Montreal also. So we had kids with physical disabilities, and we had deaf kids. And that meant that I got to be included with everybody, and so we got to play with each other. We had lots of exposure, so there was it was fantastic growing up. And in that sense, those are the people that I felt a lot of affinity towards, who didn't judge me for being weird, and it was how I made some of my earliest friendships. And so I didn't suspect that there was anything. I mean, yes, I was told I was weird. There was many ways that I was obviously not fitting in, and in some cases bullied. But because I kind of had a bit of that protective environment, I kind of feel that I was still able to forge some friendships and have some understanding. And it wasn't until I really got out into the working world that it started to really affect me. And university as well was extremely overwhelming for me. So I went through all of my 20s pretty much struggling with severe anxiety and depression, and trying to go for therapy and counseling that was trying to address this anxiety and depression that wasn't actually caused by, not 100% anyway, because I do suffer from persistent depressive disorder anyway, but it wasn't all the persistent depressive disorder's fault, what I was going through. So when my son finally got diagnosed, it was, again, another fantastic experience. The psychologist said, normally when the kid gets diagnosed, usually one of the parents that might also, she kind of put it out there. And I looked at my husband. I said, "Well, it must be you. Can't be me, of course." And and then I mean, it is still possible that it could partially be him. We have a lot of autism on his side of the family, all the cousins almost. Anyway, all that to said, I finally picked up a book by an autistic woman named Rudy Simone, who was writing about what autistic women want their partners to know. And I started reading that book, and I got to like the first 3 pages, and I said, "Oh my gosh, this is me. She's describing me." And it was the first time I'd heard a description of autism based on feminine traits. And so I went and got tested. So I went a little bit after my son was diagnosed. I went and got myself tested and got confirmation.
Interesting. You know, it's funny because my diagnosis was only a year ago at CAMH in Toronto, and I'm still learning so much. And just some of the examples you gave, I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. I went through that too. You know, my first university experience being on my own and everything and being totally overwhelmed. And I had forgotten all about that. So another thing to add to my list of, yep, this diagnosis is correct. Anne, how about you?
Yeah. So, I mean, when I was a kid, I was diagnosed with like things like problems. Like I was I saw an occupational therapist. I had, all the sensory issues, but like a lot of autistic women, the autism diagnosis didn't come along with that. And then it's really similar to what you experienced, Kelly, that I took my son to be diagnosed. First of all, I resisted diagnosing him, even though people were telling me to take him in because he was just acting like normal to me, like by my standards and stuff. But we did take him to get diagnosed when he was about just before he turned 3, and he was diagnosed as autistic. And then the same thing after, when we were getting the diagnosis, she looks at me and she said, a parent who has autism, you shouldn't feel bad like you made him autistic. You shouldn't feel like he was copying you and that's why he's autistic. Autism just happens. And I was like, what was that all about? Like, I didn't even understand like what she was talking about. And it took me a while for it to click in. And I realized, well, that's why I know how to play with him in a way that he likes. And that's why I understand so many of the things that he's experiencing. I watched as he's gone through 15 years of his life, so many of the same challenges that I had faced. And I think the book that really clued me into then how to parent him differently than like the norm of the time, like 12 years ago, would have been Barry Prezant's book, Uniquely Human. And that really also was helpful for me to realize, like, we're not from another planet. We just have to figure out some of our communication and sensory issues. And then, of course, coming across the concept of the double empathy problem was also really helpful.
Well, thank you so much both for sharing that. I know that both of you are very active advocates in the work that you do, and I love that you're both Canadian because so many of my guests are not Canadian. Not that I don't love them too, but it's nice to have people that are, in my area, in my country. So I'd love to start with, let's go back to you, Anne, and talk about how Autistics for Autistics started.
Different than your experience, the experience that I grew up in this like small mill town in the United States, and it was really like the special ed kids were in like a different building behind the school, right? And it was a punitive approach. I initially thought that we would have totally evolved as a society since then. But in the Toronto District School Board, we really have not at all. And so I realized, like, wow, like somebody has to be doing more advocacy than is being done. Like all I saw happening for autism advocacy in the public eye anyway, were these giant rallies for ABA at Queen's Park. And I was like, well, that's not what I'm looking for. So how do we build a organization and work with other organizations that already exist to kind of really advocate for alternatives and new approaches to inclusion? And so myself and a couple of other people, we were in a Facebook group called Autistics in Canada. And we said, why don't we try to become a chapter of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network? And then we did. We realized that you come into being as an organization, no one kind of taps you with a magic wand. Like you just make things, like you make a website and you put out a blog and you have a social media, and all of a sudden you're kind of real and people start turning to you and asking you questions. And then you can get your foot in the door where I couldn't as an individual, as a parent, get my foot in the door to talk about inclusion. I was able to once we had like an organization to do so. So we've been around now for, what would that be, 7 years? And we're still working away at it.
Yeah, and I remember following you guys right from the start and just being so grateful that you existed, because I was so overwhelmed in my parenting experience and doing the blog and, focusing so much on having play-based alternatives to ABA that I didn't have any extra spoons, so to speak, to do advocacy work. And a lot of people kept asking me about that. And I would refer them to the Autistics for Autistics website and just all of the stuff that you do. Thank you for that work. Kelly, I know that your organization works to get employers to understand and include autistics in the workplace, but tell us about how that all started in your journey.
Well, I thank my son again for that one. So at the time, the concept for that came out of the fact that I had just been to Parliament Hill. I have my actual House of Commons 2017. So on the November 30th of 2017, I went to the House of Commons in Ottawa with Autism Canada to protest the DTC, not protest the DTC itself, but to the changes or to the way that it was being implemented.
What's the DTC?
So the DTC is the disability tax credit.
Okay.
And so one of the issues with it, out of the many, is that many people were having to prove and reprove their disability over and over and over again. And so we teamed up with Diabetes Canada and MS Canada as well, because people with diabetes, let's say they had, they need insulin to live, are being asked to prove that they still actually do need insulin to survive day by day by the government in Canada. And people who would say who are amputees had to prove that their leg hadn't magically grown back in 5 years. And so it's a horribly onerous process to the point that 65% of Canadians don't even bother trying to apply for it, even though they're eligible. And this is a problem that persists still today. So even though my son was diagnosed with autism, which is a lifelong diagnosis, the government is asking me to reprove that he's still going to be autistic when he's 18. So his DTC will then expire. And so we were at Parliament Hill trying to make some change, hopefully, force the government to start making better decisions about how they're discriminating against us. And so I came back from Ottawa that day, and I was tucking my son in, and he was 8 at the time. And I told him that I was at Ottawa and what I was doing there, and that I was trying to make things easier so that when he turned 18, he wouldn't have to hopefully go through this crap. And he said, well, Mom, you've got 10 years. Like, what's the big deal? And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, you're right. You can do a lot in 10 years. If I start now, I mean, why the heck not? So, and so, yeah, it was the gumption of an 8-year-old just saying like, yeah, dude, go do it. So I did. So in 2018, I registered my business. I was still working full time at the time, and I kind of transitioned out that way with the idea that I was trying to make the path easier for others, because there's no point in taking a so-called diverse person, plopping them into a toxic workplace and expecting them to succeed. That's not how it works. We need to completely change society, first of all. We need to change workplace cultures. And my hope is that by changing people within a business, that, you know, you don't just like take off your hat and leave all the knowledge that you've learned at work. You're going to go home into communities. And I want people to have a better understanding if they've learned something from me at work during a training, and they go out on the bus and now they see somebody on the bus who's rocking and humming, and they understand now, okay, there's no harm in this person. This person has a right to be here like anybody else. And we don't need to stare. We don't need to accost them. We don't need to call the police. We just need to take our bus and go on with our day like normal people, so-called normal people, like kind and respectful people. And so that was my hope, that changing workplaces, I would eventually change all of society and communities. And I still have another 3 years. So that's what I'm going to do.
Let's see how far we can go. Yeah, it's really incredible to me how COVID changed so much and at the same time didn't change much. I know that I am so grateful that I have a job where I can work from home, because I think about how challenged I would be trying to manage getting everything ready in the morning, getting my son out to school, getting to work on time, getting back after, all of those kinds of things. And I've recently learned about the Autistic Culture podcast, which you may or may not be familiar with, but hearing them talk about autistic culture really helps me understand, like, oh yes, like this is so normal to me. And maybe growing up in a family where your family stuff was normal, you didn't realize that you were different than others, although I always did feel different when I went to other people's houses. But they talk about that whole idea of the monotropism and the flow and all of that, where we have these periods of, and I mean, I have them all the time. I could sit for 18 hours straight and just work on my website and forget to go to the bathroom, forget to eat, forget to, just this intense focus and intense productivity. But then having this autistic inertia where, you just have to lay down and you can't get out of bed till 1 p.m. or whatever, and just needing to come down from that, and then having this intense period of productivity. And the 9 to 5 isn't cut out for that. So that's just another example of what you said. Like, there's certainly all of the sensory stuff, like fluorescent lights in the workplace, the cubicles with all the noise that people experience, like just so many different things. So I definitely will put the link to Kelly's website. She does trainings in workplaces and stuff, and all of this stuff, and we can talk more about that too. What I'd like to ask you both about now is, like I just mentioned, since COVID, so much has changed, yet so much has not changed. What have you seen in the landscape since 2017, when it sounds like that's when you both started these professional endeavors? Because, one thing that I saw was this explosion of neurodiversity affirming clinics, podcasts, social media, tons of self-advocates online describing their experiences. And that wasn't around before when my kid was born. Until Neurotribes by Steve Silberman, nobody ever heard of the word neurodiversity, and many people still have never heard of that word. But it is definitely taken off. So, I'm sort of more in tune with a lot of things that are going on in the States because I work for ICDL and they're in the States. Tell us, Anne, what have you noticed that's changed since 2017, or not changed?
Not changed. Well, there's a lot that I wish has changed that hasn't changed enough yet. But change within any institutions always change very slowly. And one of the institutions that changes really, really slowly is schools. I think workplaces, actually, my perception, and Kelly, you can jump in, but I feel like workplaces are really open to neurodiversity trainings. They're really interested in learning about neurodiversity and inclusion and being proactive. I feel like maybe there's been a bit more progress there than there has been at schools, but I'm not sure. I also, I'll go out on a limb here and say there also could be a little bit of in society what I would call maybe neurodiversity fatigue. That is, we spend a lot of energy and time talking about what neurodiversity is, but there aren't enough programs like Kelly's and some other programs. There aren't enough programs like that aren't just talking about what it's like to be neurodiversity, what it is, but really talking about inclusion and what we can do. So we have a lot of awareness without as much action to go along with it. And I think that's kind of where I see what's happening now being very exciting in terms of neurodiversity self-advocates starting to make connections more with parent and family groups and with employers, with healthcare institutions, because I think we need that kind of partnership beyond just making people aware to actually be able to give people tools. So we've done the critique, right, of what's wrong. Now we're really in the stage of really giving people tools, and then hopefully we'll be seeing a lot more progress.
How about you, Kelly?
So I'm a little bit more pessimistic or perhaps realistic in terms of what is actually occurring. I have seen an absolute uptick and tank since George Floyd, so since Black Lives Matter kind of exploded. And the last 2 years particularly have been extremely awful and going backwards. I think it should be precise, like I should be a bit more precise about what I actually do, because I include, because I have an intersectional approach, because I include race. DI is a bad word, right? Being woke is bad. And so that has affected business. It has affected my own business, but it has affected other businesses' perceptions and where they're putting their money. It was always a struggle in the first place. So for me, it's not just about neurodiversity. It's about neurodiversity, but with that whole intersection. Because I'm non-binary, I'm Black. I'm proud of these things. I don't hide these things. I think that I have some light skin privilege that helps me be a bit more palatable. But when it comes to dealing with politics and when it comes to dealing with businesses, I am still not the people that they want to hear from. And I'm still a topic that is still very uncomfortable for most people to deal with.
Yeah, and I hear a lot about that on different podcasts too. There's a lot of good discussions happening in the US, a lot of Black women who are talking about these kinds of issues on different podcasts and who have different approaches. I've heard from, psychologists, business people, and that. And so the awareness is out there, but I think the divide that's happening with politics, and we don't need to get into all the politics, but there really is this idea of like, it seems like half the people totally being behind it and yes, this is the right thing to do, and then half the people being like, oh, I'm so sick of hearing about this, I don't care, and just dismissing everything. I don't know if that's really what's happening, because if you think about it, if we talk about these general principles of understanding people and accepting, like, most people would agree with that, but it's something about, no, you don't think so. No.
That hasn't been my experience.
Yeah.
Well, you can't just educate people. Yeah. Go ahead,
really
sorry.
not just 50%. It's really it's not even just dismissal. It's the outright, they do not want to address it. They do not want to change. They want to keep the colonizer, systemic, capitalist society. That is where the comfort is. So it's a want. I'd say it's a very clear not wanting to change.
And I'm so glad you're on the podcast because, I don't experience a lot of stuff because I don't go out of my house. And so it's important that anybody listening hears all of this experience, because I can't ever know what it's like for people of different race, even though I can appreciate it and I have friends who tell me about it and that. But to have that feeling of just not just being welcome, but to actually feel like dismissed and rejected and like you described is just horrendous. And it's not the messages that we hear from our Canadian government, yet it's happening. So
well, I mean, we hear it with we're talking about Quebec. We had Legault who said that there was no racial problems in Quebec,
oh, okay,
right?
right.
But at the same time, banning the wearing of a hijab. So I mean, it's being addressed. It's been very clear that immigrants are not wanted, and that if you're not a Québécois de souche, which I am because I am part Québécoise, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. My skin is still the wrong color. I don't speak properly. It doesn't matter.
And these kinds of things will never solve in a 40-minute podcast for sure. But I want to go on that topic. And you sort of started and then you stopped. You said education isn't enough. So everybody's heard the education. There's the subset of people, in Kelly's experience, the majority of people not listening to the education. What kind of things can we do?
I think it's a combination. I mean, you look for those little cracks and rays of light coming through, because when you're dealing with institutions, I mean, the nature of institutions is not to change, right? And I'm talking about school as an institution, politics as an institution, everything, right? So how do you then kind of breach that and make change? You look and try to find individual people that are open-minded enough to be a change agent within, say, a school. And that's what we see. A lot of innovative school programs that are happening are just kind of done on an ad hoc basis by some individual who just really cares about it. We're not really seeing it coming from above. The only institution, I think, that we really will need to rely on and do kind of leverage is law. So if you look at successful social justice movements, for example, the civil rights movement in the United States, they were marching. They also had like a lot of lawyers, and they had a lot of people working on looking at policies that already existed, making sure that they get enforced, changing policy, litigating when policy wasn't, when laws weren't being followed, and litigating to create precedent for laws that would then set a precedent where if you're not being treated fairly, you can go through the courts. And some of that is starting to happen, I think, for neurodivergent people as well, particularly students, particularly in the United States, around human rights violations, around issues like restraint and seclusion in schools. And a lot of times, if something doesn't want to change, an institution doesn't want to change, you have to make it change by going to the courts. And kindly going along and educating is, that's not going to work. So then you come back and with the law. That's something that we haven't done very much of at all in the neurodiversity movement, certainly not in Canada. And I think that's kind of the next step to make sure we have existing disability rights legislation in Canada, but it makes scant or no mention in some cases of people, of autistic people. So then how do we work with that law and get our disability rights enforced?
Yes. So Kelly, what do you see as the path forward to make your son's experiences different? And is it about reaching out one-to-one with certain people who are inclusive and interested in change and being these change agents? It seems to be that certain people come along and make little things happen, and then those are examples for others, and kind of a snowball. But in this backwards movement of the last 2 years that you've described, what do you see as your path in the next 3 years?
So I've always kind of had a multi-pronged approach. If you go to my website, you can see what I have as active bills and briefs and signatures of things that I'm working at in terms of addressing the politics. So I also have a policy where I only sign petitions that are going to go to the Quebec National Assembly or towards the House or the Senate, because I don't want to waste time in things that aren't going to actively go anywhere or make any actual change. I'm actually going to be in Ottawa again next week with Dawn Canada this time. Dawn is the Disabled Women's Network of Canada. Because we're celebrating our 40th anniversary. We're the longest running feminist disability rights organization in Canada. And so I'm not going there. I'm going there for that, but I also have a whole list of bills that I'm and briefs that I've submitted that I'm working on. And I'll bring that up also because I want to encourage your everyday Joe. You don't have to be special to write a letter to a senator or to the parliament or to address a bill or to submit a brief. Anybody can do it. It's free to do. You don't need a stamp on your letter, or you can email it. And so I have it on my website because I am encouraging other people to go ahead and sign joint statements. If you're interested in the same bills that I'm interested in, which are quite vast. So for me, seclusion and restraint in schools is a big one. The elimination of that. We still allow corporal punishment against children in Canada. We're one of the last countries in the world to still allow that, which is embarrassing, just horribly embarrassing, and is in violation of the UN rights of the child. But anyway, all that to say, I do one-on-one work. I do advising work. I do consulting work. I am working with other nonprofits. I am on a board of another nonprofit. I go and stand up at Parliament. I'm not shy to do those things. So to make change, I think it takes a whole lot of different angles. And even, people ask me when I'm talking about just inside a small business, they say, oh, should you address the top or from the bottom? And I said, it's everybody. It is everybody. It definitely helps, of course, if the top is interested in helping. Because if without that buy-in, it's not going to happen. But I always tell people it's not an HR issue. It is an everybody issue. It matters as much to finance as it does to your programming department, whatever. It's an everybody issue because we're everywhere, because diverse people are everywhere. And it's a human issue. So it's not about going to one place and saying, oh, well, it's on this person to change, or it's on me to do the education. It's really everybody's got to get together and do this.
And I always wonder if, people seem to be drawn to stories. And so, love it or hate it, the Love on the Spectrum brought so much awareness to autistic experiences in the US because you get to love these characters that you see, and that may not be the ideal example, but I always thought having some kind of little bio or people make little cards with a picture of their child and putting some of the, their interests and what's hard for them, and that giving those to teachers, or even having a way that explaining to the other kids, like, this is so-and-so, he likes this, would be a way to have inclusion. Now, you'll always have bullies, I think, but do you think having these personal stories helps? Like, I know that, and again, with the Canadian politics aside, I know there's the MP in Alberta who has Mike Lake has an autistic son, and every year in Parliament he has him speak. And so, knowing someone who has an autistic child is not enough because you don't know the ins and outs of what they experience, but having personal stories like that, does that help? Is that another way to go about it? Or, like Kelly said, is it just, I don't want to hear about it, I don't want change, that's nice for them, but it's not my life? What do you guys think?
Is that for me or Kelly?
Whoever.
I have stuff to say, so go ahead and I'll jump in after.
I would just actually tell a story. I was interviewing this woman for my book, and she has a kid who has high support needs, a daughter, and the school will send home sometimes pictures, like email pictures. Here's what we did in class today, and kind of showing her child in the classroom. And what she acknowledged to me in the interview is, well, my daughter is different at school than she is at home. We've created a place at home where she can really be her authentic self. and she's more relaxed at home. And it's not even that she doesn't want to go to school or anything. We all know what that's like. There's the joy of missing out where you don't go, but then there's also the fear of missing out where you do. And so she's always balancing that. But the point is that her daughter's different at school. Her daughter feels tension, stress. There's a lot of sensory things coming at her, and all of the things that we feel when we're in these noisy, crowded environments. So she realized that the teachers aren't seeing her child being her authentic self, her happy self, her stimming self, her self that's in her zone and in her flow, like you were talking about, Daria. And so she started, while they were sending pictures to her during the week of what was going on in school, she started sending pictures to the school of what her daughter's up to on the weekend. So that kind of has this strategic, if you will, way of humanizing her daughter and making them understand that she's a three-dimensional person. She's not just the person that's at school, and maybe hoping that they will aspire to make changes in their classroom to get more of that authenticity and relaxation from her. That's under the assumption that they really want to do that extra work. And then I think the second part, just that I would wrap up with, would be, if they don't want to do the work, what do we do then? And that's where you look at policy change and litigation, basically, to make sure, especially around the issue of restraint and seclusion, which in the US, the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint has done a great job with that as well. They do the combination of education, alternatives to seclusion and restraint, but also trying to go state by state and get it banned.
Yes, Kelly.
So there's a great piece of advocacy that can be done when we're talking about communicating with educators, communicating with teachers, making sure and teaching your kid how to do this at some point too. I have a similar story to Anne's in the sense that my youngest son, we're still waiting for the results of the neuropsych eval, but we're pretty sure that he's got fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And so having people understand that, which is, so-called invisible, and having the teacher describe very, very classic FASD traits that my son was experiencing in class. Like, for example, she's like, well, he was counting and then he got to a number and all of a sudden he blanked, and he knew it before, but like, it's gone. And she's like, isn't that, does that seem odd to you? And I said, no, that's 100% consistent with fetal alcohol. Like, there's nothing odd about that at all. And I explained to her, like, and I started sending her links and stuff. So it's because at least there was that openness there for her to want to understand better, because she was like, well, is he just not motivated? I said, that's not a motivation thing. Kids are not, anyway, let's not even go into that. But it's not that he doesn't want to learn, and it's not that he doesn't want to do his best. His brain is not letting him right now. And I think also it's really important too, because again, people see a person and they make assumptions about that person. For example, for the longest time with my eldest son, who was autistic, and extremely stereotypically autistic as well, and they'd be like, oh, but he's so cute. Okay. Mm-hmm. Why are these things apparently not compatible? And so this perception of, well, he's cute, therefore it's like as if he's less disabled somehow. And so I was having this similar thing with Fast, with like, well, he's cute, he's smiling, he's having a good time. So if he gets a mistake or if he's not understanding the material, it must be because he's not motivated. How did we get there? So when we're talking about educating people in general, there are ways to do it. There's research-backed ways to do it when we're talking about sensitive things like racism or ableism or any other discrimination. There's a fantastic book I'd love to recommend. It's called The War for Kindness, Building Empathy in a Fractured World by Jamil Zaki. And he goes into different processes that were attempted in the past to, for example, getting Holocaust survivors and other people who were, anti-Semitic people to go together and bridge their differences and things like that, and how they managed to do that. They had Ku Klux Klan members suddenly, being able to engage with Black people. and that there's ways to do it without causing harm to both sides, and in a way that is sustainable, that will actually work long term for all people involved. So it's really important when we're talking about storytelling that we don't get into this process of what has commonly happened a lot of times in the past, especially when we're talking about DEI trainings, this idea of racist storytelling. We call it a racist story time. So everybody get down and start talking about all sorts of discrimination that you've experienced so that we can hopefully build empathy in the white people. No, that doesn't work. That doesn't work. It leads to fragile white tears. It leads to just people going, well, you had a rough time. So great. That's not what builds actual change or what actually stops people from being discriminatory. So again, that's the kind of stuff that I address in my work. I use trauma-informed, research-based ways of doing it. It's not just going in and saying, hey, be nice to each other now, everybody. It's really talking about the core issues and how they affect us all.
Yeah, because no child is born racist. I mean, my kid is in one of the most diverse communities in Mississauga, and he doesn't notice skin color. He doesn't notice, those things are learned. So there's got to be a way to unlearn them. And I think the book that you recommended, I'll put in the notes for sure, because that kind of experience, and the first thing that jumped in my mind when you said that, the example that I thought of was when the comedian Sarah Silverman, is that her name?
Mm-hmm.
She was down in the south of the US interviewing hardcore conservative and just having conversations about things. And at the end of the conversation, they end up hugging and they totally get to see each other's perspectives. And I think that's, one example of the type of thing that you're talking about. If that kind of thing can happen more, where people are so isolated in their own social groups that they don't really have that empathy for others because they don't know them and they don't understand the experiences.
I think it's really important. I know the way that you put it might not be the best. It's
Yep.
important that your son see color. It's important that he sees those differences.
Okay.
So saying like, oh, well, he doesn't see the difference. No, I have a difference that I'm proud of.
Yep.
And if you choose to not see my blackness, you're ignoring a whole part of my identity and my culture and my language and my nationality. And if you choose not to see the French side of me as well, you're ignoring a whole other part of my identity. If you choose not to see my autism, you're ignoring that whole part of my disability. If you choose not to see my non-binariness, you're choosing to see, to ignore a whole aspect of my identity that is core to me and that I am proud of. And I'm allowed to be proud of, and I'm allowed to want to share my culture or to experience my culture or my language in different ways and share with different people. And so when we walk around and we say, well, I don't see color, you're choosing not to see people as the multifaceted individuals that they are, and you're choosing not to see all of their identity as whole people. So really important.
Yeah. I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I certainly didn't want to imply that I think I don't see color, or people that say that isn't kosher, because I agree with you 100%. I just meant that the way kids grow up, they learn to be racist. So how would you suggest, what kinds of things could I say to my son? Because, for instance, he's super interested right now in asking Google, how do you say this in Finnish? Is the funniest language that we like, because soccer ball is jakkapallo pallo, and all these funny sounding words. Kupakakko is cupcake. So he loves hearing that. But oh, what language does so and so's family speak? And okay, how do you say this in Urdu? How do you say this in Arabic? How do you say this in? And so he knows about different languages, even though some of his friends may or may not speak those languages, but their parents do. What are the best ways to foster that in our children?
So the same way that children aren't, they have to be taught to be racist, you can also teach them to be anti-racist, which is actually more important. And you can teach people to be anti-discriminatory, so anti-homophobic as well, like all those things. And so by introducing those topics, it's okay to talk about those topics, right? And you can make comparisons, but it's really important to talk about the value or the strength of different people and different cultures. Not just, we're not going to dwell on some of the more negative aspects of a certain culture or religion or whatever. To acknowledge that those things exist, and at the same time acknowledge the richness, because it's not just a single, we're multifaceted. And so I have an example of where I failed at that. I was doing a great job of that with my eldest. My eldest is biracial, right? He's a mixture of my husband and I. And we talked a lot about, I put him in African history courses. I did all sorts of stuff. Like, we talked about it actively. I was talking about Rosa Parks and MLK and everybody. And I taught him how to be an ally because he's light-skinned. And then we had our son, who's adopted, and he's Inuk. And so I went full on into, like, let's talk about indigenous and like culture and how amazing the Inuit are and how resilient and all sorts of positives about that. But I neglected to include my own culture when teaching him, which resulted in me being called the N-word at some point by my child, and realizing that that was a result of me not adequately teaching about Black culture. So we kind of went, whoops, went a little backwards about how we're going to do this. And I had to have those conversations and talking about different cultures and not just his. And so I think to me, that's a great example, because of me being actively anti-racist with one, and then being like, let's embrace his culture 100%, which is important. Mm-hmm. But it was at the expense of my own.
Yeah, and I think depending on where our children are developmentally, intellectually, and things like that, I think my son may or may not grasp and understand a lot of the concepts. So conversations and stuff. It's one thing to know and have friends. It's another thing to really, truly understand the experience. It's one thing to acknowledge and see and not have a problem with the way other people live. It's another thing to understand the identity and their experiences and really empathizing with it, and then helping make change so that everybody feels included. And that, I think that's like the step that is really missing.
So again, research shows that you don't actually have to completely understand in order to not be discriminatory. You don't have to. I know, like, because and it's something that I think people get kind of hung up on, where they really like, okay, well, if I only understand 100%, then I can like start, finally stop being like biased or hating or whatever. No, you don't have to. You don't have to. And the fact is that you will never. So let's be realistic. So there's two things. There's two myths, again, that kind of go on with these trainings a lot of the times. Two myths that go on is, one, that you'll get rid of unconscious bias. No, you will not. You will not. You can learn what they are and then make them conscious, and then you change your actions in accordance to that. But they will be there. You will always have a bias. That's okay. You're a human. And then two, you do not have to fully understand in order to empathize. So we can still make change. You do not, great example. I was advocating against circumcision. And it became a workplace discussion at some place when I was working at this IT company. So it was very predominantly male oriented. And he's like, what do you care? At some point, because I was going on about it, and he's like, what do you care? You're not a guy. You don't have a penis. And I said, but I care about the pain of other men. And I just don't think it's necessary that we do that. And so I don't have to have a penis to care about circumcision. I don't have to be gay to care about gay people. Like, you don't have to be Black to care about Black people. You don't need any of that. You can acknowledge that some people have had it rough. And it's really that simple. Really, really that simple. Some people have it rougher than you. That's not a competition. It just happens. Systemically, there's different ways and different barriers. And just understanding that concept and then changing your actions in regards to that if you need to. But a lot of it's exposure. A lot of it, I asked this question, it became very, 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 very heated at some point. 5 years ago, with all this explosion with Black Lives Matter, I had asked, I said on Facebook, I said, do you have any other Black friends? I hope I'm not your only one. That resulted in a lot of white people unfriending me.
Like, oh my God.
Much, you know, and a lot of white tears. A lot of people, well, Kelly, you know, I'm a good person. You know, I can quote MLK. I'm like, what the hell does that do for me? And I didn't say you weren't a good person. I asked how many Black friends you had. Mm-hmm. And, oh, well, I can't just go out on the street and pick up a random Black person. I get it. And I'm not telling you to do that. It's about, but to consciously think about who are you mixing with? If there's a group, if you're at a conference and there's 200 people and you go to strike up a conversation with a stranger, are you always going to people that look like you, or are you going to people that are a little bit different? I'm not asking you to be best friends, but who are you actively trying to engage? Who are you learning from? What, the authors that you're reading, are they always the same type of person? Just think about it. And again, once you think about it, you can make changes if you think you need to. I went through all my friends on my friends group and I realized, hey, I'm missing Eastern European. What does that say about me? Does that mean I haven't had enough exposure? Does it mean that we're having some sort of cultural divide where we're just not able to connect? What is it? And so for me to have that time to think and reflect and go, okay, now what can I do about it? Because it doesn't, if it's not a them problem, it's a me problem. So again, I'm not going to go on a corner of the street and start yelling, hey, Eastern Europeans want to be my friend. That's not, again, actively think about who are you approaching? Who are you talking to? Who are you choosing to engage with? What makes you comfortable? What makes you uncomfortable, and why?
And the first thing that comes to my mind is I'm half Ukrainian.
Again, hey,
but again, it's like what you said, I don't speak Ukrainian. I didn't grow up in a Slavic country. So how East European am I? My perspective is so narrow, and I love having guests on that broaden the perspective. Any last comments before we wrap up? Any last thoughts to leave our listeners with?
Well, I would just refer people to the website for A4A. That's A4A that's the number 4. So it's A4AOntario.com. As well as if you're interested in my books, I have a website that's booksbyanneking.com, or you can go to anneborden.ca to learn about my new book and the podcast and some of the other projects that I'm working on.
And I love Anne's podcast. We didn't even get into all of the stuff she talks about on her podcast, the problems with autism, pseudoscience, and all of that kind of thing. But I've definitely mentioned it in other podcasts before, and given other links. I'll put links to all of that in the podcast. Kelly?
We didn't talk about play.
Yes, I know. We need to have a part 2. Okay.
Let's do it. It's been a great conversation. I've taken a ton of notes. It's really been so interesting. I want to say thanks to Kelly and Daria too. It's been great.
Thank you both so much for being on the podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been Autistic Moms Chatting, a We Chose Play podcast from affectautism.com, where you can find the show notes for this episode. Thanks for listening. This episode is made possible with the generous financial support of Affect Autism's members and of the International Council on Development and Learning, ICDL.com. Please share this episode on social media, sign up for our newsletter, and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, or Instagram. Find out more at affectautism.com.